Isaac Guerendo. Christian McCaffrey suffered a PCL injury on Sunday night against the Bills. He was placed on IR on Monday. Now, it was looking like Jordan Mason then would be a big fantasy football winner, but he has a high ankle sprain. He's on IR too. So it's time for Isaac Guerendo to be the number one back for the San Francisco 49ers. Now, we haven't seen a ton of Guerendo this year, but we have seen his big playability on full display. He's had a comparable success rate to Mason this season, and his rushing yards over expected per attempt has actually been better. Now, Guerendo was a prospect who didn't have really great collegiate production, but the size-speed profile was absolutely there. That's what got him an Isaiah Pacheco comp in the ZAP model. Now, there's some worry about his receiving upside, and we might see Patrick Taylor steal some work there, but I think that Guerendo is going to be the primary early down back for San Francisco at the very least. Like, there's a lot of upside here. The 49ers have a pretty good running back schedule rest of season as well, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. This is the last month of the fantasy season. You can't take your waiver budget into 2025. So whatever you have left, unload it on Isaac Guerendo. Buy George Kittle. So no one's like upset if they have George Kittle in their tight end spot in fantasy football. But he's coming off a game where he scored fewer than 2 PPR points. He had a 12% target share. Maybe there's some concern. But this transaction exists because the Christian McCaffrey injury, it may be pretty beneficial to George Kittle down the stretch. With CMC in the lineup this year, Kittle has averaged about a 15% target share per game rate. That rises by over 8 percentage points without McCaffrey. And that's because the 49ers throw to their running backs more when Christian McCaffrey is healthy. It's that simple. Their target share per game rate with CMC this year is 24%. That's to the running back position. It's 15.5% without him. That volume has to go somewhere. And it's going to be littered throughout the offense. Someone like Kittle, or maybe even someone like Juwan Jennings, they're going to benefit. So don't lose sight of that with this CMC injury. Drop Kyle Pitts. Look, we've gotten to the point where we have to ask, is there any real difference between Kyle Pitts and any other streamer that you get off the waiver wire? He's been beyond disappointing this year. He had a nice 4-game stretch in the middle of the season, but as I noted on a previous 15 transactions episode, the Falcons during that stretch, they had a cakewalk schedule for tight ends. Since then, Kyle Pitts has been horrible. Over his last 4 games, he's averaged 3.4 PPR points per game. And it's not like he's seeing targets and just not converting. His target share per game is 8.4% during that time frame. He ran around on 65% of Atlanta's dropbacks on Sunday. That was his second lowest mark of the season. Now maybe the Falcons look at how bad their offense looked in week 13 and they say to themselves, we got to get Kyle Pitts more involved. I would just be really hesitant to use Kyle Pitts in the fantasy playoffs. Especially considering in weeks 16 and 17, the 2 most important weeks of the fantasy season, he gets the Giants and the Commanders. Those are 2 bottom half matchups for tight ends, especially when they face the Giants. Add Juwan Johnson. So since I'm talking about some tight ends, let's continue with the theme and talk about Juwan Johnson. Taysom Hill is out for the year. He suffered a knee injury on Sunday. Now Hill isn't this like traditional tight end, but his absence could make Juwan Johnson a little bit more viable moving forward. Johnson ran around on 79% of New Orleans dropbacks in week 13. That was a season high. His 14% target share, nothing special, but that could rise just given the competition in this offense. New Orleans tight ends also get the Packers and the Raiders in week 16 and 17. Green Bay's been the 6th best matchup for tight ends this year by adjusted points allowed. Vegas, the 3rd best one. So at the very least, Juwan Johnson might be a decent streamer towards the end of the year. Hold Baker Mayfield. It was not a good outing for Baker Mayfield in week 13. He was hurt in the middle of that game against the Panthers, but he still didn't come through. He scored 10.2 standard points. He's been at or below that mark now in 2 of his last 3. I just don't think it's time to bail. We've seen a ceiling with Baker Mayfield this year. Now, typically that was coming with Chris Godwin, so take that with a grain of salt. But we have seen that ceiling. And the Tampa Bay quarterback schedule rest of season, it's strong. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about what that schedule meant for Bucky Irving. So far, so good. But the same can be said for Baker. The Bucs get the Raiders, Chargers, Cowboys, and Panthers over their final 4 games of the fantasy season. Only the Chargers rank outside the top 10 as a favorable opponent for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. We can sit here and say they're going to run the snot out of the football, which they're probably going to try to do. It's exactly why Bucky Irving was a buy a couple of weeks ago. But the team in general should be able to score points. And if that's happening, some of those touchdowns could come through the air versus on the ground. That's obviously going to benefit Baker Mayfield. So even if you're not going to use him every week, you probably don't want your opponents to have him either. Add Sean Tucker. So we've been talking about handcuffs over the last month or so on the show. This transaction is just serve as a reminder that your handcuff doesn't need to only be some obvious second string running back. Sean Tucker is clearly the number 3 back for the Buccaneers, but he also has 2 outs to playing time. He could have a Bucky Irving injury or a Rachaad White injury. If one of those 2 goes down, then Tucker would leap into being a potential flex play with upside. And I say upside because of what I just talked about with their schedule. We're in love with Bucky Irving's potential down the stretch because number 1, he's been great this year. But also, we love who the Buccaneers are facing. Sean Tucker would take advantage of those matchups as well in this theoretical situation where one of Bucky Irving or Rachaad White goes down. Now, this is probably more of a deeper league option, but we're at the point in the season where these types of recommendations can make this list. The waiver wire continues to be pretty thin anyway. Add Braelon Allen. Now, if Braelon Allen is on your waiver wire and you're thinking about getting him instead of Sean Tucker or Sean Tucker over him, go with Braelon Allen. He has more upside, and not only that, Breece Hall's dealing with this knee injury. And yes, Hall did play in week 13, but his workload did change. He had a season-low 2.6% target share. He ran a route on just 52% of New York's dropbacks. Now, with that being said, Braelon Allen's numbers in week 13, they didn't really improve. We saw more Isaiah Davis instead. But with Hall already banged up, it would make sense to prioritize Allen as a handcuff over some of the other higher-end handcuffs. And keep in mind, no team has a better running back playoff schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed than the New York Jets. Buy Tony Pollard. So Tajay Spears returned to the Titans in week 13. It didn't really change Tony Pollard's workload, though. In fact, Pollard saw an 89% running back rush share. That was his second highest mark of the season within that statistic. But he only posted 8.8 PPR points. That was his second performance over the last 3 weeks with fewer than 10 PPR points. And it wasn't a terrible matchup either. So that's probably making fantasy managers a little bit nervous. I lean on the side of him bouncing back, though. Pollard hasn't dipped below an 11% target share in a single game this year. In his remaining matchups this year, they're against the Jags, Bengals, Colts, and then the Jags once again. That gives Tennessee running back, specifically Tony Pollard, the best final stretch of opponents in the NFL according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. I know your trade deadlines are likely past, but this is a buy recommendation to tell you that you can be confident with Tony Pollard. Add Adam Thielen. So Adam Thielen was featured on this show a couple of weeks ago as an ad, but he's getting the nod once again because he had a huge game against the Buccaneers. And yes, it was Tampa Bay, but Adam Thielen hit a 24% target share in that game. That was by far his highest share of the season. And his week-over-week route participation, it jumped up by about 10 percentage points. That's according to PFF data. Bryce Young is playing better football, and Carolina wide receivers have a top 10 playoff schedule according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Adam Thielen probably needs to be rostered in most 12-team leagues. Buy Kyler Murray. So according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, Kyler Murray has faced just 3+ matchups this year. Meaning he's faced 3 teams that rank as top 16 favorable opponents for quarterbacks. Those teams currently rank as the 14th, 15th, and 16th best matchups. It's been a roller coaster of a season for Murray, at least from a fantasy perspective. He's shown off that ceiling at times. He has multiple 28-point performances. But as we know, the floor has been kind of rough. Part of that, though, is because Arizona quarterbacks have faced the second toughest schedule in football by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Their 4 remaining games of the season aren't nearly as bad. They get Seattle, that's the 14th ranked team that I was referring to earlier. New England, they're the 9th best matchup. Carolina, the 6th best matchup. And LA, the Rams, they're the 15th best matchup. Now, those divisional games, they might be a little bit scary, but this is objectively an easier path than Murray's faced all year long. So I'd be more optimistic than pessimistic about Murray's December. It doesn't mean that you have to start him no matter what, but it definitely means you shouldn't be giving him up to another fantasy manager. Hold Rome Odunze. The Bears' offense has looked a lot better without Shane Waldron. Unfortunately, Rome Odunze is not really benefiting. Over the 3 games without Waldron, DJ Moore has 30 targets and 265 receiving yards. Keenan Allen, 31 targets and 200 receiving yards. Rome Odunze is at 26 targets and just 129 receiving yards. So the good news here is that Odunze's target total really isn't that far off from DJ Moore and Keenan Allen's. He's just been used a little bit more down the field, and his catchable target numbers, they're a little bit lower. That's led to him playing over 5 PPR points per game below expectation during this non-Shane Waldron timeframe. That's according to PFF's expected fantasy points model. But look, guys, it's a small sample and things can change. And not only do the Bears have a solid rest of season schedule, but we know there's contingent upside here with multiple injuries. If one of DJ Moore or Keenan Allen go down, Rome Odunze will get a projection bump. A good projection bump. So this is all to say, don't drop Rome Odunze. He scored single-digit PPR points in 3 of his last 4, but he's the exact kind of player that you want on your bench this time of year. Add Parker Washington. So Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis are done for the year. Back in week 9, we saw this Jacksonville Jaguars offense without those wideouts, but it was against Philadelphia. The Eagles defense has been playing lights out. Week 13 was the second time that both of these wide receivers were sidelined together, and Parker Washington was great. He saw a 28.6% target share against the Texans this past weekend. He got 6 of 12 targets for 103 yards and a score. It was the second time this season that he hit a 20% target share. The first was back in week 9 when they faced Philadelphia without Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis. You see the theme here? There's a chance that we get a lot of Washington down the stretch, even if Mac Jones is the one who's quarterbacking. The Jags don't have an amazing schedule, but he's worth a look this week, at least in deeper formats. Add Kendre Miller. So there's a chance that we see Kendre Miller return this weekend. And former head coach Dennis Allen, who seemed to just not like Kendre Miller at all, he's no longer in the picture. Interim head coach Darren Rizzi said, quote, "I don't have a doghouse. My doghouse is empty at the moment. I don't have a dog." That was when he was referring to Kendre Miller. He also said that he's a, quote, "talented player who can produce for the team." No one knows where this is going to lead, but Alvin Kamara is a 29-year-old running back who's gotten a ton of work this year. Maybe they don't want to overwork Kamara, and they give Miller a decent chunk of work down the stretch, especially with Taysom Hill sidelined. So again, in deeper formats, that's kind of what the waiver wire is like this week. I do think that Kendre Miller could work. Add the New Orleans Saints defense. So speaking of the Saints, they get the Giants this week, and the Giants offense is bad. Defenses against New York have ranked as a top 10 weekly fantasy scorer in 7 of the Giants' last 8 games. Over the Giants' last 6 games, they're averaging 4.3 sacks per game allowed. New Orleans is a 4.5-point road favorite. That game has a low total too. They're an obvious pick for a streaming defense. Add the Arizona Cardinals defense. So normally you only get one defense out of me on this 15 transaction show, but it's the end of the season, or at least we're inching closer to the end of the year. I want to just provide as much utility as possible. You don't need another buy or sell recommendation when your trade deadlines have passed. The Cardinals defense has been strong over the last month in fantasy football. I don't know if people realize it. They're coming off a fringe top 10 performance against the Vikings, and they ranked as a top 6 option in their 3 games prior. They've been good in fantasy. And over their next two, they get Seattle and New England. Seattle's been the 6th best opponent for defenses this year by adjusted fantasy points allowed. New England, they've been the 5th best opponent. So this Arizona recommendation, it's actually for 2 weeks, not just one.